You're listening to Mornings with Cassie McCullough on ABC Radio Sydney.
Yeah, do you get scam calls? I get them more and more, I have to say. And also scam text, a lot of those as well. Stuff that you're never supposed to receive on your phone at all, but they still get through despite all the attempts to stop that happening. But what about the actual phone calls, and you make the mistake of picking up and they start talking and perhaps they start to sound a little bit convincing. They might sound like this US call.
Okay, can you help me with your
who is
first
this?
and the last name? This is Social Security Administration of the state of Texas, miss.
Okay, I'm sorry. So you said who? This is
Miss, can you
Social
help me?
Security.
Yes.
I feel like I'm there. I feel like that's me trying to figure out what's going on there. It's so tricky and so devilish, isn't it? Researchers from Macquarie University have listened to hours of that, can you imagine? And they've looked at the different stages and they've identified these stages and the patterns in the calls so we can know what to look out for. Maybe you've got experience of this. Maybe you've stopped a family member for falling for one. 1300 222 702. But let's talk to Professor Dali Kaafar, who is an Executive Director of the Cybersecurity Hub at Macquarie University and part of this research. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning, Cassie. How are you going?
Firstly, I want to know about your mental health, listening to all these calls. What was that like?
Oh, well, in fact, we didn't necessarily, listen to those as individuals. We made machines listen to those. In fact, we made machine learning techniques applied to these calls, and these are rather machines listening and extracting those patterns. And of course, we did listen ourselves to some of these sometimes funny conversations.
That's amazing. So the AI now can listen to a conversation, follow the language, and then put it in useful kind of patterns for you to understand. So when you got the data, what were the things that you started to identify? What's the classic setup?
Well, yeah. So this is actually, as you pointed out in your introduction, more than 100 hours of scam calls, representing about 300 of those. We were mostly interested in extracting some sort of sentiment analysis and emotions that would be, presented to the possible victims. And in fact, we were interested in patterns that would represent those scripts that the scammers would go through. Elements of anger potentially, or elements of empathy, or the proposal of an assistance. The scammers would generally, if you're really kind of listening to those conversations, you'd identify immediately that this is a scammer. If you don't fall for their trap, of course. And so we were interested in really finding out whether they are obeying to particular scripts that they would run through their victims. And sure enough, this is essentially what we identified, not only as patterns, but in fact, the research is showing that there are common transitions in those calls between topics that would reflect essentially that this is running a scam script.
Okay, so what you're saying really is that they follow this very set task, and it's up to the individual scammer to bring the acting to it and to keep a compelling voice and interaction with the listener. So go on.
So scammers would actually run different type of scripts, of course, depending on the topic that they're presenting to their possible victims. But all in all, you could really put that or break it down into multiple stages. So the first very obvious one that all of us probably have heard, answering to some of these calls, is the piece of introduction where they're trying to set up the scene, right? So introducing the reason for the call, very often in an aggressive and hostile way, by the way, presenting you with a very serious threat that would require an imminent type of legal action or suspension of a bank account or suspension of your social security card or things like that. Essentially establishing some form of credibility and authority in particular. So making you really under pressure to take an imminent decision. I mean, most of the time, what scammers would do as well in that introduction phase is they will put in elements of creating some elements of credibility, sharing some possible known or, pre-guessed type of information about yourself. And that, we found that sometimes this is really illustrated through the collection of some personal information about yourself. Like, for example, sort of guess about your date of birth from social media and so on. And that's a very, very important phase in the scam call. And then the next few steps are as important as the first one, of course. Really, actually, doesn't necessarily depend on how you would be reacting, but they will be offering some form of assistance. So this is where the scammer now is posing themselves as a helpful instructor, for example, trying to build up some form of conversation with you in a very polite way, very often. And this is a very interesting, transition from that element of authority, sometimes anger and kind of aggressivity, to an empathy sort of way of proposing help, so that you feel you're being looked after in a sense, and you have more confidence in the person whom you're talking to.
So the stage one is introduction. They introduce themselves, the issue that's going on. Stage two is that they can help you. There's this assistance, as you say. This is the assistance stage. I'll get to stage three and stage four in a moment. But let's hear from some people who've been through this. Maybe you've had this experience. 1300 222 702. Have you encountered scam calls? Maybe your family has been called by scammers. What was your experience? And did you manage to fend them off, or were you sucked in? Love to hear from you about your experience. 1300 222 702. Janice is on the line. Good morning, Janice.
Good morning. I just called in to say that I think sometimes it's dumb luck. So I know I had left my baby, teeny tiny baby, at home alone with my mum for the first time and went out, and I got one of those calls that were doing the rounds that said if you didn't pay the money they were going to turn up at your house with an arrest warrant. And now normally I'm a fairly logical person, but because I was already feeling anxious about leaving the baby alone, I mean not alone, with my mum, but you know what I mean, the thought of my mum then having to deal with some police officer at the door just sent me into a flat out panic. And I wonder how many of these work, maybe not for that exact example, but maybe you've just been fired and then you get a scam call and you're not at your best.
Yes.
And so things that normally you would look at and go, that makes no sense. Why would the police be waiting for my credit card details before they serve an arrest warrant? Suddenly you're in a panic and you're not thinking logically, and you actually believe them that they are going to do this.
Yes. Yeah, for some reason you're emotionally vulnerable because something's going on, whether it is, what you were just describing, and absolutely understandable. You're separated from your baby and then you hear this, threat in a way, even though it's not an overt threat, but someone's going to turn up there. Of course you're not going to sit there and go, well, hang on, and go through a cold, calculated assessment of the veracity. That's the last thing on your mind.
Yes, and of course I'm anxious about my daughter, but if a police officer did turn up at the door, then my mother would have been anxious about me. Like, you know what I mean? It was just this circle of bad luck. And of course the police officer did not turn up. But I often wonder how many people were just having a really awful day when they fall for these.
Yeah, and I guess if you try it often enough, you're going to find someone who's, not having a great day. Hey, really great point, Janice. Well made. Thank you for that. What about Heather, who's joining us from Barara Heights? Good morning, Heather.
Hi, Cassie. A few weeks ago, I had a phone call on my landline, which I think might be a catch for getting older people, because they're the ones who have the landline still. And very well-spoken gentleman told me that his company worked for the major banks and that they were there to intercept fraud. Well, he didn't say fraud. Anyway, he said to me that there is an $800 amount that is going to be taken out of your bank account, and it is an American transaction, and we can stop that for you. And he said to me, have you had any $800 go through your account? And I said, no. And he said, well, we can I said, look, I think I'll stop this call and I would like to ring my bank and talk to them about it. But we are your bank, he said. We are representing your bank, all the major banks, and he listed the major banks. And then he went on to ask me didn't ask me for any details as yet. And I just cut it and I said, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to ring my bank, and put the phone down. And when I did ring my bank, they said, well done.
Yeah, gold star.
That's going on at the moment.
Yeah. So it was that pushing back, and he'd already anticipated that you were going to do that.
Yeah.
And, yeah. Well done.
Yeah, I'm hoping that this gives other people the warning and the courage, because when they come back and say, oh, no, but we are working for your bank, then I thought, oh, maybe. And then I thought, no, stop it.
Yeah, that's the assistance thing, isn't it? And we're trained to be very nice and polite, and maybe that's not always going to be working in our favour in a situation like this. Yeah.
And we are aware, and we think we're going to do it. And he nearly got me.
Well, I think the $800 would have only been the start of it. So well done, Heather. Thank you for that. Yeah, good.
Okay, thanks, Cassie.
Good one. Heather there, who went through it and headed it off at the pass. Yeah, okay. So what we've seen there, Professor Dali Kaafar, is a classic example, and that assistance phase that you were talking about. Maybe you've got some thoughts. 1300 222 702. Jump on the phone. Let's go to the next phase, which is the threat phase. And here's another example of that.
Yes, you are not listening to me.
Please, be a gentleman.
You are not listening to me.
I'm listening, dear. I will let you complete your part.
Miss, someone has access to your personal information, and you might be a victim of identification theft. So even if I believe you, all the evidences together portray a different
W5.
picture. But as you are claiming all the information to be false, which means I have to give you a chance to prove that you are innocent and you have no connection to drug trafficking or drug dealing.
In isolation, it really does just sound crazy, Professor Kaafar, it doesn't actually, it sounds so mad.
So this is one of those that is illustrating that element of reinforcing the threat again. Now this is an interesting example for stage 3, as you said, Casey, because we hear now the scammers starting talking over the victim, really not paying any attention to questions or introducing that element of time pressure again to prevent the victim even from thinking about it.
Yeah, ratcheting up the tension.
Yeah. So now the element of reinforcing that threat, citing police or court orders maybe, and maybe sometimes even like possible jail, with all the negative consequences if you don't take immediate action.
Let's hear from somebody else who's been through this. Margaret is with us. Hello, Margaret.
Hello, I'm just driving, so hopefully I've got a good signal.
Yep.
I unmasked a scammer
How did you do it? Last week. How did you do it?
Okay, so this bloke called James, and it's not his real name, but that's the one he uses, kept ringing me, and I was polite to begin with because he said he was from a wine company. I thought, something my husband signed up for. But then it was clear he hadn't. But he just kept talking over to me, and I'd say, look, I don't drink, he'd ring. I'd say, I don't drink for, religious purposes. I'd say I was under 18 and he'd still ring. And then I looked him up online, and people were complaining about this James. There's a whole website to it. So then I looked him up on company records and found his real name. And next time he called, which was last week, I used his real name, which is unusual. Like, it's an unusual name. And I said, X. I don't know what I'm allowed to say on air.
No.
X, if you keep on with this conversation, I take it that you are agreeing for me to record it under the Listening Devices Act of 1968. And I wasn't recording it, but I was going to next time he did and give it to a current affair. And then I said, I know everything about you, and I listed where he lived and his date of birth, and he's never rung me again.
Oh, well done. So you looked at his number. You went back. How did you identify?
No, it wasn't his number. I identified him through his scammer name, which is his middle name, and then also the company, the wine company that he said he was working for. So I looked that up online, and I saw lots of people were complaining about him, so then I did a company search and found him. But on the online, because he was annoying me so much, on the online forum, someone else had done the same thing, and all the details are there. So if you're a victim of this guy because he's bad and he rings all the time, just get online and get his details and do what I did.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. Thank you for that, Margaret. I didn't realise that. I mean, that sounds like some wacky individual for sure. But, yeah, you sort of think of it happening in a distant call room somewhere and not necessarily with individuals like that. So, okay, you got to be alert. It could be this. Let's hear from George, Now, George, what happened with you?
Okay, good morning. What I did was I had a phone call about 4 months ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in that phone call, the lady, it was actually a lady, and she said that we're from a security company in the US and we've seen some transactions on your account. And I said, can you just hold there for a minute? And she went, yeah, sure. And what I did was I then put on my radio voice and said, hi, you've reached Radio Sonara and you're in the chance to win $5,000 cash. And she went, what? I said, yes, your chance to win $5,000 cash with a simple answer to this question. And she said, so what is the question? And I said, the question is, who is the current Prime Minister of Australia? And she couldn't answer it. And I said, I'm sorry, next caller, please.
Oh, my goodness. That is very funny. I mean, there have to be a fair proportion of Australians who couldn't name the Prime Minister, I guess, but...
Not at the moment, anyway.
Probably not at the moment. Oh, that is funny, George. Good on you. Well,
so if anyone's thinking about getting scammed, maybe have a little script next year and just play the scam back onto them.
What was Bradman's batting average? Yeah, that might get it.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, well, good one, George. Thank you very much for that. That's an innovative technique. Just quickly to John, who is also with us. Good morning, John.
Oh, good morning, Cassie. A standard trick for combating these guys. You say, okay, thank you for this information, but let's just be careful. Can you give me your phone number and I will phone you back and then we'll go through the procedure. That will kill them stone dead because no way do they want to give you their phone number.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. All right, that's a really good technique. Thank you for that, John. Just to the fourth and final stage that you've identified, Professor Dali Kaafar, you know, the closing part of the deal, the stage 4. So we've got introduction, assistance, the threat that they might make, the payment. Describe that. What happens in that part of this scam?
Yeah. So this is actually the final stage, and this is to some extent the most important part for the scammer. But this is where it gets really tricky, Casey, because the data there shows that the conversation now becomes less organized as the scammers are trying to finish the call, getting to what they're after, literally, which is either a payment or making the victim download some sort of malicious software to install on their machine. Essentially, this is where it gets tricky from sort of psychological tricks that they are using. And sometimes very, very difficult to really kind of collect any, particular reasoning behind this particular script. This is literally, if scammers come to, that close to this particular stage, where they have enough from the victims to possibly make a deal, or close the deal, now it really becomes very, very difficult to kind of identify, particular scammers' behavior. And this is really a tough one. And, my opinion is that this is where literally possible victims have to pay very, very close attention. And unfortunately, the most vulnerable of us would be actually falling for this particular one. Under all of that sort of introductory part, making the victims kind of under pressure and threatened by possible court orders or, citing police and all of that. Some of us, unfortunately, may felt for, this particular payment piece, right, or close of the conversation piece. This is where the most vulnerable of us would end up kind of giving up and installing that particular piece of software that sometimes, or very often, in fact, leads to, ransomware attacks later on and so on. So the story, if it's a payment, ends here in a very sad way, unfortunately, for some of the victims. But sometimes it's kind of only the start of a, further sort of scam, in particular if they're successful in making the victims install a particular piece of malicious software.
That's when the alarm bells go.
Yeah, the conversation we've heard, those examples that we have just heard are interesting because, they show us how most of us are probably, will be essentially picking up that this is a scam call. Now, unfortunately, the data, for example, is showing that just in Australia, every single one of us is receiving on average about 6 scam calls per month. And unfortunately, many of us would actually fall for some of these.
That's the average, six calls a month per Australian.
Yeah. In comparison, we're actually pretty much receiving similar number than people in UK or people in Germany and Europe. Brazil and US are relatively more prone to scam calls. I think the
they're nicer than us. See, we're nice, and the New Zealanders are even nicer, and so that's why we're soft targets, I reckon. And also in 2021, more than $100 million from Australians was scammed. They were stolen. Yeah.
And the trend is keeping, is increasing really. 100 million lost as just reported, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. In particular, the data is really showing that we're looking at probably globally somewhere around the $30 billion being lost to scam calls.
That's amazing. Huge. Yeah. Well, you can see why, people do it. It's lucrative stuff. Hey, thank you so much for helping us out with a bit of some tips there. Really interesting research.
A pleasure, Casey.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you. Professor Dali Kaafar, Executive Director of the Cyber Security Hub at Macquarie University, with these 4 stages that the average scam call goes through.
This is Mornings with Cassie McCullough on ABC Radio Sydney.